So yesterday, Deputy Commanding General USAREC, General Michaelis, was encouraging recruiters during the town hall, and he said this quote that I thought was really cool. He says, "Recruiters, we all need to maintain buoyancy in a sea of rejection." Let me say that one more time. He said, recruiters need to maintain buoyancy in a sea of rejection. And if you are a recruiter, you know what he was talking about, because every day you are confronted with rejection. Every month you are confronted with failure. And one of my missions is to help you maintain that buoyancy, whether you are a recruiter or a family member, or really anybody watching this video who's dealing with failure in some way, shape, or form, or threatened by the prospects of failure. Failure sucks, but it does not have to be the end. Failure is painful, but it truly can be the beginning of something great. And that's what we explored last week, looking at the life of Peter, or 2 weeks ago, looking at the life of Peter. And if you remember, I encourage you to go back and see that what comes after failure, the life of Peter. Peter's worst moment was his greatest moment. And Peter's moment of deepest despair was at the same exact time his moment of greatest opportunity. And so in order to kind of visualize kind of what I talked about last week, I'm going to put this chart up here I made. It's kind of primitive, but I think it tells the story. And you know, see, we start out with Peter was successful. He had the raw materials of leadership. And then he met with great failure, and that put him at a fork in the road. And you can see that as expressed there. And on one side of this fork in the road is the path to humility, which will ultimately bring someone to great leadership, or can bring them there, which it did for Peter. But on the other side of the road, this fork in the road, failure can lead to shame. And shame is a dead end. Shame will ultimately lead to death. And we see that with Judas. And I didn't want to do a whole lesson on Judas, but I do think it's just interesting to kind of just go down this rabbit trail for 1 second and compare Peter and Judas, because in many ways they're similar. You know, they were both followers of Jesus. They were both considered leaders of the disciples. And I talked about Peter being a leader last week. Well, the Bible says that Judas was the guy, the treasurer, the guy who carried the money for the disciples. And so that's kind of a sign of leadership there. And so we have these two men who were leaders among the disciples. Both of them failed Jesus at a point of Jesus' need. And so they were on the same trajectory. They were at the same point of failure, but that is where they separated. And Peter went down the path of finding humility on the other side of failure, and that brought him to be a great leader, to be a name that we all appreciate today. Judas, on the other hand, found shame and went down the path of shame in his failure, and today he's a curse word. So they separate at that fork in the road. Well, Moses, the gentleman that we're going to study this today, he kind of went the Peter route and found humility after his failure. But he had a very similar trajectory as Peter. Started out as very promising, had the raw materials of leadership, had this moment of failure, and for Moses it was a real long moment, but then on the other side found himself to be what they call a transformational leader. And that goes back to the first lesson on what comes after failure. If you remember, the social researcher James Collins, who wrote the book Good to Great, said that the top of the mountain, as far as leadership goes, is his transformational leader, and that's what Moses ended up. But if you look at Moses' life, he lived in 120 years, the Bible says he lived. And it's very interesting. You can split his life up really into 3 40-year, easily as pie cut sections. The first third of his life, the first 40 years, Moses was tremendous success. The second 40 years of his life, he realized he was an epic failure. The last 40 years, he realized that God can use failures. And he did great, wonderful things. So you can look at it this way. You could say the first third of his life, Moses thought he was somebody. Next 40 years of his life, he learned he was nobody. In the last 40 years of Moses' life, he learned that God uses nobodies. And so we can see this as if we explore Acts chapter 7, in which the apostle or the disciple Stephen kind of tells the story of Moses' life. And what's going on in Acts chapter 7 is Stephen was a follower of Jesus. He was arrested by the Jewish leaders for blasphemy. And so what Stephen is doing in this chapter, he's trying to connect the Old Testament Moses story with Jesus' story, hoping that that would be his defense to say it's not blasphemy, it's just all part of God's plan. But in doing that, Stephen tells Moses' story. And he says this in Acts chapter 7, verses 20 through 23. I'm going to read just those verses right now. It says, at the time Moses was born, he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter, Pharaoh the king, the emperor, the leader of the land, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her son. Now listen to this, verse 22. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So you know he got a great education if he was the emperor's son. And he was powerful in speech and action. So just from those verses there, I'm going to go out on a limb and say Moses was a good leader, successful, an alpha male. He had raw skills. He had raw materials. Much like Peter, I think much like a lot of our recruiters who are successful, great soldiers. This area, this first 40-year period of Moses' life, as I mentioned earlier, was a time where he thought he was somebody. His cup was full. He was well-schooled, well-trained, well-educated, powerful in speech and action, and what he said had influence and had authority, and his cup was full. He was able to look in the mirror and say, I am confident in who I am and in my competence. And we see that manifest in Moses' life, because there was an incident where Moses saw an Egyptian harassing a Jewish person. Moses was Jewish. And so he goes and takes matters into his own hands and he kills that Egyptian guy. Well, he's thinking he's doing something good, but it actually turns against him. And people are like, watch out for Moses. He's bad news. He's trouble. Egyptians and Jews alike. And he realizes he needs to run out of town as a fugitive because people hate him now. He operated in the I can handle this mode. Let me fix this. I am capable. I'll fix this. It turned against him and ended up in verse 29. We're skipping a couple verses. It says, when Moses heard this, and this was the Egyptians and the Jews kind of turning against him, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner. So Moses, full of himself, competent, successful, takes matters into his own hands, doesn't turn out as he likes, so now he's a fugitive. He's in the desert of Midian, which is western Saudi Arabia, rugged, nowhere land, nothing, and he ends up, the Bible says, as a foreigner. And the Greek word is paroikos, which means alien or one without rights. And so here he is, you know, this leader, this second in command, if you will, in all the land, Pharaoh's son, now an alien, someone without rights. He ends up marrying a girl from Midian, and for 40 years Moses spends his life as a shepherd, taking care not even of his sheep, but of his father's sheep. This enters the second 40-year period of Moses' life, where Moses learned he was a nobody. He was a nobody. Then in verse 30, it says, after 40 years, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of the burning bush while he was a shepherd, while he was in Midian, after 40 years. So this serves two purposes. One, it pushes the story forward and it will bring us to the third chapter of Moses' life. But it also, at the same time, it tells us that Moses was in the desert working as a shepherd for his father-in-law. You could say living in his father-in-law's basement for 40 years. So think about this movement in Moses' life, from a gifted young leader, powerful in speech and action, to herding sheep that weren't even his and living in his father-in-law's basement. This 40-year period, the second 40-year period, was Moses' time in the desert, if you will. His moment, 40-year moment of failure. This is where, if you go back to that chart, he was at the fork in the road. How was he going to respond to failure? Exodus chapter 12 verse 3 is an interesting verse, and it kind of helps us understand what Moses' response was. Exodus 12 verse 3 says, Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. So we learn what direction Moses took when he was at that fork in the road. And if you look at verse 30 again, it says that after 40 years of this failure, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of the burning bush. And if you know the story of Moses, it's there that he got his mission. It's there that God commissioned him to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt, across the desert, and into the promised land. It is there that he was anointed as the deliverer, as the transformational leader that he eventually became. And that moves us to the last third of Moses' life, the last 40 years, where Moses learned that God uses nobodies. And it's one of the greatest lessons that life can teach us. You might be a nobody, but God uses nobodies. It's when he led Israel through the desert. He became that transformational leader. And today, like thousands of years later, Jews, but not just Jews, Christians, but not just Christians and Jews, Christian, Jews, and Muslims all point to Moses as the overarching transformational leader in that era, in their religion. And it brings me back, all the way back to the first lesson of leadership that we talked about in What Comes After Failure, Part 1, where I mentioned this picture right here, this triangle that social researcher James Collins put together about the evolution of a great leader. And right at the top of that triangle was this leader who was marked by personal humility. And that personal humility, I'm going to tell you, Moses learned through that second hard, dark, painful period in the desert, where he learned that he was a nobody. It's the same humility, or the same failure, that Peter learned. Peter learned it in a much more compressed amount of time. But it was that failure that sprung forth this humility that enabled these men to become the transformational leaders that they did become. So I want to end this lesson just reminding you of the 5 things that failure taught Moses, that failure taught Peter, and that failure can teach us today. Number 1, we realize that we are human. We make mistakes. We fail. We're not perfect. Number 2, we need to let go and we need to let God. And we see this in both Peter and Moses' life. They wanted to assume control of the situation. They wanted to exact justice. They wanted to fix things. And so failure teaches us, no, sometimes we need to step back and let God do his thing, because we cannot control everything. Number 3, what looks like the end isn't the end. For Judas, what looked like the end was the end, and he ended it. He committed suicide. But for both Peter and Moses, what looked like the end, their point of failure, their point of brokenness, actually wasn't. God had substantially greater plans than anything they could have imagined. And I believe God does have the same for you, if you are at that fork in the road in regards to failure. Number 4, my value as a person is not based on my performance, because if it was, both Peter and Moses would have ended at failure. And number 5, the incredible significance of grace. Somewhere in the midst of that sea of rejection, in that sea of failure that both Moses and Peter were swimming in, they found the grace of God. They found grace, they found hope, and they were able to live with themselves and move on to that great future that God had for them. I encourage you to watch the other failure videos, what comes after failure videos I have out there. This is part 3 of a series. If we started out part 1, we talked about what does come after failure. It was humility. Part 2 was Peter's story of how he exemplified it, and now part 3, Moses' story. And it all kind of is wrapped up in that little fork in the road where failure brings us to humility or shame. Today, in the middle of a hard time our country, our world's going through, you still can today walk in peace. You still can today have the best day possible.